Okay, we have attendees filing in. I'm going to wait just one more minute. Okay, I am going to get started knowing that there's more folks funneling in. I just wanted to welcome you all to our third workshop in this fall series. I want to welcome you on behalf of Journal of the Plague Year, a COVID-19 archive. We call it JOTPY. And this is our third workshop in the series, Teaching the COVID-19 Archive. I'm Marissa Rhodes. I'm an ACLS Emerging Voices postdoctoral fellow, and I'm working with Arizona State University's School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. And I'm mostly working with their rapid response archive / global curatorial consortium, whatever you want to call it, JOTPY, which has grown to be the world's largest COVID-19 archive. Assisting us with today's event is Rachel Bunning, Communications Program Coordinator for Shippers at ASU. And I'm going to serve as today's chair and moderator. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn so that their introduction comes right before they actually speak. And some logistics, some notes on logistics. We don't currently have the chat function open for attendees. We will open that up toward the end for folks who want to use that for questions, comments, anything like that. For now, you may enter your questions at any time. Feel free to enter a question you have for a panelist while they're actually speaking. They'll be able to make the choice whether they want to address it right then, or if they want to hold off until our discussion at the end. I think that is about it in terms of logistics. Yeah, so let's get started. So up first, we have a tag team, Victoria Cain and Claire Tratnyek. Victoria Cain is Associate Professor of History at Northeastern University. She's a historian of the modern U.S., focusing on the history of education, media, and technology. She's authored 2 books, Life on Display, Revolutionizing U.S. Museums of Science and Nature, University of Chicago, 2014, co-authored with Karen Rader, and the forthcoming Schools and Screens, A Watchful History, MIT Press, forthcoming 2021. So on the history, yes, and on the history and politics of educational technology in the US, that's what the second book's about. So before becoming a professor, Cain taught middle school and high school. I'm also going to introduce Claire Tratnyek as well, because they're going to be working together here. So Claire Tratnyek is a doctoral student in history, studying demographic shifts in the Boston public school system. She uses images and the uses of images in history textbooks and museum curricula. Before returning to Northeastern for her PhD, Claire taught elementary and middle school in Boston for 9 years and holds teaching licenses in history, ESL, elementary education, and special education. Claire earned her BA in European history and anthropology from Franklin Pierce College and MA degrees in history and in teaching from Northeastern University. In the summer of 2020, Claire worked at WGBH Boston as the Education Department Doctoral Fellow. She contributed to a project called PBS Learning Media, Assessing the Present and Visioning the Future. During the fall of 2020 semester, Claire's working at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum as the Thinking Through Art, TTA, Doctoral Research Fellow in their museum's education department. She's coaching Boston public school teachers in visual thinking strategies with their students. So go ahead and take it away.
Well, first of all, we want to welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know one commonality this fall that we are all struggling with is too little time and overwhelming exhaustion as a result of our classes. So we really appreciate you showing up and giving us at least divided attention. Claire and I started working on a series of teaching modules this summer to help educators at a variety of levels use the COVID-19 digital archive. We had worked together before, actually teaching a public history course for undergraduates that was really aimed at sort of intro history students. Like we had like 40 engineers in that class. So the class was really about teaching students what history was and how to get their hands dirty and do it themselves. What was challenging about creating history, how to approach and analyze historical documents, and how to think about the politics and the production of history in the public sphere. So when we created these 6 modules, we really had that audience in mind, that audience, and then also the audience of educators. We wanted to create 6 modules that would be really easy for teachers to use, something that was totally plug and play, where people could just insert them into a pre-established curriculum, that they would be ready to go. The readings, the questions, the assignments, the discussion prompts, it would all be there because, again, we know we're all tired and overworked. And the idea here was to make everybody's life easy while at the same time providing opportunities to use this incredible resource of the JOTPY Digital Archive. Claire, I'm going to hand this football to you.
Yeah, thank you again, everybody. I hope this is helpful and useful. But yeah, I mean, I think, Victoria, you hit the nail on the head. The goal with creating these modules was something that professors and teachers in a variety of different disciplines would be able to work in relatively seamlessly. And we are going to go through the modules with you today. There's 6 of them, but we also wanted to make them very customizable. I know when I was in the classroom teaching, I was never using curriculum exactly as it was written wholesale. I don't really know anybody who does that. So we tried to include a lot of options that could kind of be sliced and diced and put together in a way that makes sense for, for teachers and for your students. Your students better than certainly than we do. But we wanted to be able to create something where there were a lot of different access points and a lot of different entry points that you and your students would be able to kind of, pull a thread and start running with it. So that was sort of the goal there. And I mean, also just, a lot of these students, freshman students or first time in a history course students that Victoria and I worked with last year, they didn't know what an archive was, digital or otherwise. So really kind of starting in at the base level of, the production of history and of, the idea of public memory, public history, these sort of big, broad concepts, just bringing them down to a sort of very usable level. And the Journal of the Plague Year is a really cool opportunity for people to feel like they are able to access and produce something for the historical record, which is totally awesome. And I think, in a time when everybody feels super isolated and also super overwhelmed with just like crushing weight of 2020. Yeah, to be able to engage with something where you can learn about how other people are processing this and also to sort of put out there how you're processing this is a cool kind of singular opportunity. So we wanted to allow space for that kind of engagement, as well as making something user-friendly for teachers and for their students. So
absolutely. So at that, what we'll do right now is I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through the 6 modules that we designed, and we'll sort of talk you through it very quickly. And then we're going to put a link in the chat so that you all have access to those modules. If you miss the link, if you, for whatever reason it doesn't work, you can also find the modules on the JOTPY website under the Teaching the Pandemic tab. And they're all available. That use them, abuse them. I mean, don't abuse them, but use them as you see fit. The idea is that these are a jumping off point for a variety of different levels of education and educators, and we intentionally designed them so that they could become either more sophisticated or so that they could become a little bit more palatable for younger kids as well. These could easily be plugged into a high school class with a little bit of a modification or a reduction of the suggested readings.
Yeah,
so now I'm going to go ahead and pull this up, share the teaching modules. Let me bring this down. So we have an overview of the modules describing what they do, what the aim is, and how we recommend using them. We designed the modules so that they could either be used on their own or that they could be paired. So if you want a whole week's worth of assignments, or if you want to take a 2-week period, you can do that. But if you have one 45-minute class period, like, that's good too. You can absolutely make use of them that way. So let's just go ahead. Claire, should we start by going through the modules? You want to take module 1?
Yeah, that sounds good. And we'll just switch up. Yeah. So, and one other thing is that whether you're in person or hybrid or online, like, all of the activities and things are designed so that it really doesn't matter what kind of mode you're in. They should be pretty adaptable.
Right.
So
and we also provided all the readings to that end. So it's like everything is there. It's all complete out of the box. So you don't have to do any research.
Yeah. Yay. Although if you've got great stuff to add, add it and then tell us about it if it works great. We would love to hear that. So we have pairs well with as sort of a section that you can see on the bottom of your screen there. Each of the modules says another module or 2 or 3 that might go well with it. But in general, the first module, which is Archives 101, would be the best place to start. This is really basic information about what an archive is and how they function. This is probably, I would recommend starting here regardless. And then if you're going to pair any 2 off, start with this one and then go to whichever other one you are doing. There's a specific focus in this one for why archives are important to governments and to scholars to functioning democracy, something we can all talk a lot about very happily nowadays. So yeah, that's module 1 in a very small nutshell.
Absolutely. And the nice thing about starting with this module too is that it gets your students directly in touch with the Journal of the Plague Year and shows them how they can contribute to it, how they can start assessing and using it as a tool for research and as a tool where, again, they can be part of making the historical record as opposed to simply consuming it. In module 2, we get a little bit more sophisticated, and we talked specifically about the digital archive, how a digital platform can change the nature of archiving, and some of the ethical and practical questions that can come up as a result of digital platforms. So questions of privacy, questions of access, questions that are certainly important in terms of JOTPY, which is an open access archive. And this also gets students familiar with one of the fabulous resources of the internet age, the Internet Archive, which is something that I think is helpful for students at all levels to know about.
So the third module kind of goes back to that question where we talk about how archives function in a democracy and how we can think about questions of access, neutrality. These are really big, important topics in archives. And what we want to do is we want to give students an opportunity to sort of evaluate some actual case studies and see what this actually amounts to in the real world. we want students also to be able to start assessing how easy it is to access our own government archives on a local level. And so some of the activities in this module are connected with that. As you can see, also, if the pairs well with, it does connect back to Archives 101. And you can kind of look, that's why this is kind of up at the beginning of the module's overview. When you're teaching with these, it definitely is worth taking 5 minutes to figure out what makes the most sense to teach in my class, what would my students be the most interested in, and then kind of go from there with putting a little grouping together if you're going to do that.
One of the really important values, I think, of the JOTPY archive, and I think that a lot of educators are addressing, especially in the wake of this summer's events, are questions of whose story gets told, whose stories get respected, whose stories get preserved. And Module 4, which addresses archival silences, confronts those issues head on, asking whose voices are absent from traditional and digital archives, and what do we do about that? How do the practices and policies of various archives change this? And it asks students to tackle some pretty big issues about equity and inclusion. So teachers who are looking for a way to talk about these things, maybe without having their classroom devolve into a shouting match, this is a good way to start because it gives students something extremely concrete to hold on to and to debate in terms of the practical, while they're dealing with, the issues that society as a whole in the United States is wrestling with right now.
Yeah, and kind of connected to that really closely is the topic for Module 5, which is rapid response collecting. So that's actually something that Journal of the Plague Year is kind of involved with. This is what happens when something is unfolding in real time that does need to be documented. How do we collect around something like a global pandemic, or something, like a shooting, a mass shooting, or a large natural disaster, something like that. We don't have a record of this from nothing. It needs to be created and assembled and curated. So what does that look like? What are some, again, case studies where this has worked well in recent years? And what are some of the big sort of ethical questions around this kind of work? Who are the stakeholders who should have the authority to come in and collect information and artifacts to create a record of these events?
The final module that we generated is on oral history, and it allows students, again, a particular entree into contributing to the archive and thinking about how archives get built, and also helps them develop some very useful skills in terms of listening, learning, developing interview skills, and again, thinking through how history gets made. We've gone over the modules very briefly, but I just want to take you through one in a little bit more depth so you can see how we've laid it out. And if you have questions about how this might be useful to you, we can then deal with it during the Q&A period, or you can shoot us questions in the chat. But you'll see that each module is structured this way. There are essential questions at the top, followed by a series of readings. Some of these readings are really video clips or podcasts. We really worked hard to create a sort of multimedia set of assignments. And we also made sure that at the very bottom, there was room for a course relevant reading. So if you are teaching European history, you can tweak this so that it's specifically relevant to your class. We've provided a series of discussion questions that can be used either in person or as prompts for some kind of a response paper, and a series of possible activities that can, as Claire noted earlier, be used in person, in a hybrid setting, or exclusively digitally.
And synchronously or asynchronously too.
Yes, absolutely. And then for various activities, sometimes we provided a sort of template or a worksheet that you can just print out and use, or screen grab and send out to your students. At the end, we've actually asked teachers for feedback, and we've provided a survey link, and we hope that should you end up using the modules, you will fill out this survey or have your students fill out the survey so that we can learn from you what has worked, what hasn't, and then refine these modules going forward. Claire, is there anything else you can think of before we pass the mic?
Yeah, I feel like this is a pretty thorough overview. Again, hope that these are helpful for you and for your students, and that your students really enjoy getting to engage with this archive, because it is a really cool resource, and one that I think just, I mean, you can go down the rabbit hole, right? There's a lot of really interesting things to find, but I think that the skills that they can gain engaging with this as a resource and engaging in historical practice are enjoyable and really important ones to gain. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Claire and Victoria. So just a reminder, feel free to send your questions via the Q&A function. Panelists can actually answer it while the other panelists are speaking if they'd like, or we can just hold on to them for the end. Just a reminder. Up next is Morgan Keena. Morgan Keena is a 7th grade geography and world history teacher in Nampa, Idaho. She's currently pursuing a master's degree in history through Arizona State University. Throughout the summer, Morgan interned with JOTPY as part of the inaugural intern team, focusing on the collection of K-12 materials, highlighting the struggles, triumphs, and changes that occurred in the world of public education. With school back in session, Morgan has been using the JOTPY archive to help teach students about primary source analysis and plans to have them contribute directly to the archive again in January. Morgan, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, truthfully, I don't use Zoom a whole lot, so we're gonna try this one. All right, can we all see that okay? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so like Marissa said, I teach 7th grade social studies in Nampa, Idaho. It's a combination class of geography, world history, and yeah, that's my class. So I actually got started with the archive back in March. So just a brief synopsis of how I got here. March 4th of 2020, my school district called a mandatory staff meeting and basically put us on alert. We were told that we needed to have 10 days of materials prepared, basically at a moment's notice. It was kind of like making emergency subplans. And we just were told, be ready. We're very fortunate. We're a one-to-one school district. We were ready for the shift to go online. It was just kind of a matter of when for us. Oddly enough, Friday the 13th in March was our last day with our students. And by Monday the 16th, they had said, we are starting distance learning after spring break. You have about 4 days to plan. Good luck. So at that point, I contacted Dr. Thibault to learn more about our students contributing to the archive and got in contact with him. And by March 30th, we were beginning distance learning, and we jumped into the rest of spring semester online. So one of the things that my school really focuses on is this idea of powerful learning. We have a partnership with a global organization called Digital Promise, and what they promote is personal and accessible learning that's challenging and authentic. It allows students to collaborate and be connected not only within the school, but to the outside world, and then also is inquisitive and reflective. And what I saw when I looked at the Journal of the Plague Year COVID-19 archive is that we had a lot of room there to make any virtual learning assignments throughout the spring and even into this fall. We had a lot of room to make them personal and accessible, challenging and authentic, and kind of took that idea and ran with it. So the assignment that came out of this actually was taken from another webpage, there was kind of like this flood of information that came out as soon as school districts across the country started going online, and people were sharing everything. The education world is really quite amazing when it comes down to something like this. If we're told we have to flip the world of education on its head, we do it, and we do it together, and we do it well. So my students, I have 137 students. They were given a journal assignment. And at that point, oddly enough, we were learning about the bubonic plague taking place in Europe. So we pivoted off of that one. And we said, listen, if this was you living during this time, what would you want them to know? So we kind of posed that question to our 7th grade students and said, what would you want people to know about the spring of 2020? The students were told that they could write whatever they want. We did give some prompts to them, but other than that, it was basically meant to be just their day-to-day journal, much like JOTPY is for a lot of people. We just submit our day-to-day activities, things that we run into throughout our days. So some of the questions that we provided to our students is, what is happening in your neighborhood? What things have changed between yesterday and today? What are you nervous about? What are you excited about? And it led to some very interesting conversations that we had with kids. In some ways, this provided us a way to figure out that we had students with food insecurities. In other ways, it was a way for us to figure out that, hey, kids are thriving online with online schooling. They're doing great with this. So we learned a lot of different things about them at that point. In terms of logistics, so I know there's a lot of different things going on out there. I kind of am a little unique in that I work in a 6th through 8th grade school, meaning my students are anywhere between the ages of 12 to 14. So we kind of run into, I don't know the best way to say this, but the internet basically says if you're 13, you're free to post as you will. The school district also has a responsibility to these students. So I created a permission slip and sent that out to parents. So if your students are anywhere near that 12 to 13 age range, I would encourage you to do something the same. And then my students kept their journals in a Word document. We're a Microsoft-based school, so that was the easiest way for us to hold that information. Once students felt like they had something that they were ready to share with the world or whomever, they submitted that work to us via our learning management system, which is Microsoft Teams. At that point, my partner teacher and I took what was submitted and basically checked it over for spelling and grammar. We were in no way monitoring what they were saying, keeping them from saying what they wanted to say. We basically were like, you're representing our school district. Let's show that you have great spelling and grammar. And we just let them go from there. At that point, we gave our students instructions on how to submit their work to the archive. It included us making screencasts showing them how to submit to the archive. It included lots of one-on-one Teams meetings of us saying, yep, click here, enter this, do that. But at the end of the day, the key takeaway, I think, working with any students really is that put that workload on the students. I think it's important that kids interact with the uploading process and can see what that looks like. I was very fortunate to be able to see the back end of things. So as soon as their item came in, I could show them, look, this is what happens once you submit this to a website. And so that was a good conversation for us to have as well. And I guess the question becomes, what now? As we've moved into fall, my school district started entirely online back in August. We've then switched into hybrid in the middle of September. And so we've been in hybrid for about 6 weeks now. And I've been using Journal of the Plague Year archive in a couple of different ways. 3 of our standards actually that are up on the screen here, citing specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary sources, central ideas, and integrating visual information. So students have been using Journal of the Plague Year archive to pull primary source material that interests them. So since we're a geography world history combo class, we've been using the Mapping the Archive tool where they can see the maps and where all the different entries are coming from. They choose a place that they're interested in. I teach in a school district and in a school that has a large Spanish speaking population. So they were able to pull some of those Spanish-based primary sources and read those in their native language, which was really a cool experience for them. They really enjoyed that. And then we just used a primary source analysis tool that our tech book provides to us. And they basically got to just dive deep into what was going on around them. And in some ways, kids were just shocked that that was happening in other places. In other ways, they were like, yes, I can relate to that. That's what I feel right now. So that was a cool experience for them as well. Moving forward for us in Nampa, Idaho, my school was just informed that we are going back online starting on Thursday. So we're going to take a little pause in our curriculum, and I think we're going to go back to journaling. We're going to have kids keep a journal of this experience of switching between hybrid and distance learning. And we'll be using the same prompt that we had before, and they'll continue to submit that way. In addition, this year I took on teaching a digital photography class, which has been really fun, but it also created another place for me to add the archive to my curriculum. So we are actually going to have our digital photography students take pictures to basically create a record of their time in distance learning and what that looks like. And we will get those uploaded to the archive as well. So in terms of what I'm doing with the archive right now, I am working with a couple of school districts, helping them figure out student submission logistics and that kind of stuff. I'm more than happy to help in any way. My contact info is on the screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. Up next, we have Shanna Gagnon. Shanna Gagnon is a current graduate student at the Arizona State University. As a member of the inaugural JOTPY curatorial team, just like Morgan, Shanna created the San Francisco Bay Area collection within the archive to capture the unique regional experience of Bay Area residents during the COVID-19 pandemic. Shanna also teaches U.S. history at California High School in San Ramon, California. She's currently incorporating the JOTPY archive into her curriculum by teaching students to think and act like historians and by giving them the agency to put their learning into action. Go ahead, Shanna.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am going to share my screen. Sorry here. These are getting a little out of order. I've been teaching all morning, so let me just get it correct. Okay, here we go. All right. So I am so excited to be here today to talk about how I'm incorporating JOTPY into my high school history curriculum. Like Morgan, I started this summer working on the archive. And quite honestly, I really didn't know a lot about archives prior to this experience, and especially not a lot about rapid response archives. So it's been really cool. And what I realized very quickly is that there's really no better way to think or act like a historian than to engage with an archive. So as my school district announced that we were going to remain remote, and I was trying to figure out how to give my students really authentic experiences this year, I instantly thought I've got to incorporate JOTPY into what we're doing. So that's what we've been doing. And the students, they really, really like it. And I can tell that they feel empowered, that their voice matters in terms of what they're contributing. So the way that we start and the way I'm thinking about how to incorporate the archive over the course of the year is that I want it to be kind of ever present in their mind. So every single unit we check back in with it. The very start of the year, we did introduce the archive, and very much like what Victoria and Claire were speaking to, we read articles, we watched videos, we held a discussion. What is an archive? What are silences? How do we fill those silences? Who gets to tell our story? Are they going to get it right? What types of sources are historians using to tell the story of COVID and the history of 2020 in general? And then after that, we wanted to engage them with the archive. So, and I keep saying we because I actually teach my US history class with an English teacher. So it's called American Studies. And so a lot of these can actually be used in history or English classes. But we designed a scavenger hunt. So they essentially went into the archive and we asked them to find a number of different stories and to sort of reflect on those stories. So experience of a student, a healthcare worker, a child, a marginalized group, something that used a video or an audio recording, a political aspect, economic aspect, and social aspect. So we really wanted them to see the breadth of the archive, the depth of the archive, maybe identify something they couldn't find in the archive and start to ask why, and really just engage with it. So they really enjoyed that, and all searched my name to see what I had contributed to, which was kind of fun that they could see the work that I'd been doing over the summer. So now I'm going to share 3 submissions that my students have made to the archive, and I'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses associated with each one of them. So the first actually was a culminating assessment for our first unit. We study core American values. What does it mean to be an American? And at the end of that unit, students are asked to write an essay in response to the question, is America currently living up to its core values? And for this, we actually did not give them, I didn't specify, is America currently living up to its core values in regards to COVID-19? We just let them write whatever came to mind. And what was interesting is that a number of students did not choose to write about COVID in their essays, and a number of students did. So the student in particular does write about COVID and writes about COVID in response to the racial inequalities and how it's kind of exasperating that in American society. So you can see I asked them to include photos along with their essays. This one was okay. It wasn't perfect. I think that we could have spent more time, kind of sorting through the purpose of this assignment as it relates to the archive. But I do think that it does show what's top of mind for youth today, and also kind of the intersectionality of the experiences that they are viewing their world through their lens. In the second unit, I wanted to try a slightly different approach. So instead of doing a culminating assignment, I decided to try to do a skill application. So unit 2, we study the media, and one of the skills that they're developing is how to identify bias in news sources, historical sources, and what to sort of do with that bias. So I had them select a news article that they felt represented an aspect of COVID-19 that needed to be captured within the archive. And then they actually were asked to reflect on that media piece, pull out any bias, describe why they chose that, why they think it's representative and needs to be included in the archive. And I think this one went much better. We got some individual student voices, we got their perspectives, not just on what bias existed in the piece, but also this one, for example, shows at the bottom kind of what they think the media should do during a pandemic. So you get some of their original thought in it too, which I think is powerful. And then the last one, this is my favorite one. So this is the one that I want to try to replicate time and time again. And I have to say, I saw that Dr. Cole is on the call too. I got this idea from Dr. Cole. She was my professor, Morgan's professor, for the internship over the summer. And she's also my professor in global history right now. And we had to submit a sensory memory of COVID-19 to the archive ourselves. And I thought, I should have my students do the same thing. So Dr. Cole, thank you, because this went really, really well. I actually had, and her and I talked this through, but I had my students learn about the sensory experience and the sensory history of immigrants passing through Ellis Island. Our Unit 3 focus of study is on immigration. So that's where we really brought it in, was the sensory experience of Ellis Island. And then we just simply asked students to submit their own sensory memory of COVID-19. And here we actually see a huge diversity of expression in the archive. So I just want to show you a few. And Morgan sort of mentioned this earlier as well. Some of the stuff that we learn about our students is really, really intense through these submissions. So it's just something to be prepared for, because I was not prepared for some of the things I would learn about my students in these submissions. The other thing I do want to note, and Morgan touched on this too, the permission slip is huge, having families agree to this since it is public. And I also still, even when students and families sign the permission slip, I still give them the authority to either just submit, if they're uncomfortable submitting to the archive, submit the assignment to me privately, to redact information, to cover faces, to hide their identity as much as they want to when they're submitting to the archive. And what I found is there's a big mix. Some students are like, we don't care, I post everything online, just post away, right? And some students actually do want to protect their identity. So this was a really cute one. It's a little video about their first flying experience after COVID. We've got some baking experience and food experience, a whole perspective on sports and just the sound of sports. I had a few on that, taking the ACT, what that sensory experience was like. Someone wrote a whole journal entry on the sensory experience of leaving the house for the first time in 4 months, seeing leaves in a new way and appreciating just being outside. And then these last two are about loss, which was incredibly powerful. This student actually talked about the last time she was able to see her grandmother before she passed away. And she was clipping her toenails for her. It's like, so just little moment, so sweet, but just so powerful. And then I actually have a student who lost their mother to cancer during this time frame, and she submitted her the eulogy she read at her mother's service, and then also the sensory experience of what her mother's service was like. So when I say that this one was the most successful, I mean, it was the most successful. We got such a diversity of experience and really rich and deep stories. So what's next for me is that's really what I want to continue into second semester. I want to be able to teach the students various ways of accessing the past, like we did through sensory history, food history. How are they spending their time? They are writing journals. Can we tell history through artifacts? And I am also working with our history club at my campus on an oral history project they've self-directed. And so I'm excited to be able to give them that support. I'll just end here, and like everyone else has said, I'm available for help if anyone needs it. But I did include, and all of my deck is linked in the chat, but I did include some best practices. I won't read through them all, but they are here. And these top 5 tips have really helped me through, I have 70 students. So every time they submit, it's 70 different submissions. And following these steps has really, really helped refine and keep things just organized, because it can get a little hairy if you don't keep track of what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's great, because as being someone who's on the other end of the archive, receiving all of those submissions, establishing those best practices to begin with is so helpful to curators, and it allows us to kind of build the very orderly and very rich metadata that we build when we curate submissions. So that's an excellent slide. Thanks for that. Okay, so up next is Martha Elizabeth Phelps. Martha Elizabeth Phelps, PhD, is an assistant professor in residence at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she teaches American politics and international relations. Before entering academia, she managed the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy's Oral History Project. Dr. Phelps has always believed in active learning. Her students have spoken on the floor of the state legislature, presented their undergraduate research at professional conferences, and received government internships at both the state and federal level. In 2015, she received a university level award from the NCAA Student Athlete Advisory Committee when they elected her as their faculty mentor for the year. Multiple teams nominated her for, quote, going above and beyond to support our team's academic success. Dr. Phelps is currently the advisor to the Political Science Club, the co-advisor to the Political Science Honor Society, Pi Sigma Alpha, and the co-editor of the undergraduate political science journal, Governance. Go ahead, Martha.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today, because if you're here, it means you care about your students and how to make a more robust classroom. And I hope that today I'm able to give you one assignment that can help you. I've now been teaching with the archive for 2 semesters, which of course would mean the end of spring and most of this. And I'm going to say I find this a very excellent experience. I have 68 curated entries that are in the archive already. So I've had a little bit of experience of getting things through. I am also one of the fortunate people that can see the back end of the archives as this comes in. I've had it to be a very pleasant experience. If you haven't worked with any of these archival curators before, they're an email away and they're a very fast response. So not only is it presenting lessons, it's also that the archive curators, if you send an email, the general email, you'll get an answer. So I do encourage engaging with this. I'm not from ASU, I'm over at UNLV. So this has been a very easy entry for me to work with this material. And then once I got up and running, I have to admit that I haven't talked to the curators in a while. So that best practices slide that you saw instantly, it's going to be very relevant when I talk about my challenges slide, because I could use a best practices slide, and we'll see how that comes up in a moment. I mainly teach this, this in my Intro to American Politics. I have a Nevada politics course, and then I also taught it at the Upper Division State course. Next semester, I'll be teaching research methods. So I'm coming at this from a political science angle. And what that means is I'm less interested in, sorry, y'all, what's in the archive, than more thinking about how my students can engage the archive, how can they be engaged in social science research methods, and how can we use the archive as an active learning tool. And so while I'm not in history and I'm very focused in kind of institutional political science, this tool has still been spectacular for learning. So two main things that I want to get out of using the journal, and one of them is to get real people into history. And all of you know that this is a challenge, right? We've heard this mentioned before, is that we know that we have a set of history that comes from really being the elite. So Las Vegas is in a really rough spot where we're having to choose between, should we open our economy and should we deal with a raging coronavirus set of cases? And it's really affected my students in every way of their life. So I really wanted to get this sense of diversity into the archive, saw this archive being born and went, yes, let's get Las Vegas into this. So part of it is really to make sure my city is represented and make sure my city is active in this archive. But the second thing that I'm really interested in is the idea of how do I get my students to really understand research? And since I mainly teach in a 100 and a 101 level courses, they don't really know a lot. And when they do come in, they come in with a very positivistic attitude of what is science and what is research. And that happens in chemistry classrooms and biology classrooms and physics classrooms. But political scientists, sociologists, histories, they don't do research. So a lot of what the archive gives me is a very easy entry into what is qualitative research and how can we build qualitative research into mixed methods, right? So why is an archive useful? This archive only records coronavirus stuff, but is that really all it records? What are all these other bits in there? What could a food historian do with this archive? What could somebody studying Congress do with this archive? And more so, the archive lets me ask students to think, if they had all the skills and resources in the world, what would if they were a top-level computer engineer with all their big data access and they can make programs do whatever they want? What would they do with an open access archive? And it really gets them to start thinking about the research process. So one of the cool parts of the archive is when you look at the submission part, right, rather than the output part, is they get to think about how this is being built and why it's being built. One of the things that you've heard from a bunch of the speakers, though, is that students like this assignment. This is an engaging assignment. My students, especially my freshmen, are struggling. They're behind computers. They don't want to be. They want to be out and interactive. And this assignment seems to have given them a way to interact with their peers. One of the things I didn't expect was how eager students are to tell their stories. And often some of these stories, and we'll show you a slide of this, are moving or they'll be personal. So there's a lot of bubbling emotions in my student body that have found a way out in this assignment. So it's something to be aware of as you go on this assignment. You may encounter a lot of truth. So this is what my assignment looks like. The direct link to the PDF is located in the chat. I'm happy to give it to you as text if you email me, but it's in Canvas, so it's harder to get out. And I'm going to go through each of these stages, but I just kind of want to see how the students see it. You can see the PDF down there. So the first part of any assignment, just kind of best practices, is to explain to my students why that I'm making them do this. And so I let them know, hey, we're thinking about government and the community and how those things interact, right? So I'm teaching political science. What is the realm of the state? what is the realm of the federal government and what is the realm of the community? And how are those interacting? How are governors and presidents fighting? How are companies? We're Vegas, so we have 3 main companies on the Strip. How are those companies that dominate our economy responding? And how have they bullied our governor or not bullied our governor, right? So telling them why we're learning this, also beginning to introduce them to the idea that history can be a biased creation, to talk about the silences, to talk about the absences that modern historians are doing an excellent job uncovering, but that we know that when we look at further in the historical record, that those absences can be there unless we're looking for silences. So why is that? How is that? And then further, I try to make it personal. How do they make this real? How do they touch base with both the assignments and what is happening? So after that, I make a broad explain. What is my ask, right? And there's a lot of research that talks about some students, especially more on the spectrum students, work really well if you give them an end goal. So in my next slide, I'll show you the individual steps I ask for them, but it is very helpful for some students to say, okay, what do I need to do? So this, for example, if I was going to ask them to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, this step 2 is me showing them a picture of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich and explaining what makes up a peanut butter jelly and sandwich. Then the next part of my assignment, I go through and explain the task in immense detail. And this got mentioned earlier, but again, this task, students get very uncomfortable when they're doing this task for the first time. Information is going into the public sphere. This is no longer just me. When it's just me, they're willing to have typos, they're willing to turn in crap. This is different. This is the external world that they're sharing their thoughts with, and they're very nervous that they're going to do it wrong. So I have a very broken down, this is what you should do, blah, blah, and we're doing this in a discussion forum. So everybody in the class can see this material and everybody else can interact with it. So we break it down like this. I asked for media. And I asked for media to really talk about government interaction. So I expected something more like this, a set of memes, right? Like, oh, we meet in a room in coronavirus, but now we're all digital. So we just see a student pick it, they write a paragraph about it, they send a link to the meme, they upload it, fine. This is more what I wanted, but I didn't necessarily expect to get it. This, for example, is a story from a student who talked about how she left her job, how she felt that her job wasn't safe and she went away and they got a puppy. And now she's growing up with her puppy in quarantine because of mask wearing and who wouldn't wear masks. It's a story that shows privilege, but it's also a cute little lighthearted story into a life that might be helpful for the future. Who knows? This is a picture of a calc test, the AP calc test, right? And it's interesting to watch the student talk about it, because when the student's talking about having to take a test and then uploading these pictures to the servers, even in that story, this student ends up talking about economic inequality. So it's really interesting when you just give them a prompt and they upload something like this challenge I'm dealing with, you see what leaks in and what the class talks about. There are things
Sorry, Martha, your screen isn't being shared. Sorry. I sent you, your screen isn't, at least I don't see it. And I think a couple of people also don't see it. There we go. There we go. Perfect.
Yay.
Thanks.
Sorry, everybody. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be really fast and just show you my slides for a second. This is my introduction. All my slides are online. These are my goals for using the archives. The first is to make sure that Vegas is included. The second is to enhance student learning and research, which I think the archive is outstandingly good at. This is a visual example of the assignment that I'm talking about. This is then the assignment, the breakdown of why the work is being assigned. This is then me when I was talking about the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. This is explaining the task in the broad context. And this is explaining the task in detail. Now, this is the first of the memes that I was discussing of what they said before and after coronavirus. And this is what I'm more expected to get. Casual, the media is over there and not necessarily about their personal lives. What I really got was a human experience. I got a cute puppy dog about this is how mask wearing led me to leave and look at this cute dog that has uplifting things. Then I saw things like this AP Calc test come in where they still took this idea of this is what happened to me in the archive and this is how it affected a broader picture. there were things I didn't expect to see. One of them is I saw pictures of a man and his family and the fraternity that he's with focus on racial justice, right? So even though I'm in political science and I'm asking about coronavirus, I'm getting all of these activities, all of these movements that my students are taking part of. And they really do a good job of explaining why they get to use this picture, why they get to talk about this thing. How does this relate to political science? And of course, some of them do not do a good job. I'm just trying to show you kind of my more positive experiences. And then here's what I was talking about when I said sometimes things get a little intense. And so a student submitted, and this is a cut and edited picture because I pulled the names out of this. And this is what I mean, where students are just so desperate to tell their stories, right? The student feels like they've been treated wrong at work and they don't have an outlet for it. So I end up with things like this submitted as well, talking about these conflicts. And this provides a really interesting thing because this, I feel they gave really honest and authentic things into the archive and have this idea that the trauma that is happening them could care and could have a purpose in the future. So I felt like this discussion back and forth has a real positive element to it. So I wanted to show you some of the student aspects to this. So again, I'm asking them for media or something that they've experienced, how it relates to government, and they're responding in discussion format to each other. I've had some challenges, I have to admit, and a lot of this was addressed by this best practices thought earlier. In my assignment, my hashtags have not matched what the curators want. And so since I can look on the back end, and I admit I haven't looked on the back end in a while, I can see how my tags have been changed or stripped. And I feel like maybe I'm wasting a lot of the curator's time, but maybe I'm not, because maybe I'm just giving them a ton of information and they can choose what to deal with it. And there, I don't have any control over what gets changed. So I can't look at, oh, this came from all my 101 classes, this came from all my 100 classes, because those tags have gotten stripped. So there's a little bit of disconnect, I think, between the curation team and the educational team that could be better done with best practices or communication on my part. Students are also really bad at following these explicit instructions. And it's not that they're bad at it, it's that they want confirmation every step of the way. Am I doing this right? Is this what I should be talking about? And I assign a lot of things, and I haven't encountered this insecurity. And because it's not that they're idiots, they're afraid of what these motions might be. So I found this to be a big challenge. It's new material, and the archives are new to them. Many of these are like, what the heck is an archive? And then once they figured out what an archive is, they're like, oh, well, how do I interact with an archive? Am I really just allowed to put that in there? Can I just upload things? So there's a lot of requests for reassurance in that has been challenging to me because it's very time consuming. And so that's something I'd like to work on better myself. I might need to make some videos of me going through and doing anything. Y'all, if you're on a Windows machine, take a second, hit the Windows button and the G key. If you do that, you're going to pull up the Xbox Windows thing. And the only reason you care about this is the easiest way possible to record your screen, in my opinion. So I'm just going to hit Windows G, and then I'm going to go through and upload something on my own so I can show them. Maybe I'm going to make an FAQ. The other thing is the archive is dynamic and changing. The archive's really cool, but the archive gets upgrades. So a challenge I've had is since when I wrote, because I write all my stuff early, when I wrote my stuff in August, the archive's in a different place now. So it's a lot, I had students, I asked them to upload and they used to instantly get a link back. And now the archive, I think this is smart. Now the archive is going through and looking at that information before they instantly spit a link back out, leading to my students to have some creative answers, most of which were great. They just screenshotted it and sent it to me. But then there was some additional panic. So I did find that this assignment and assigning the archive cost me a little bit more effort at first. I think that's going to be a learning curve. But even with all these challenges, the benefits that the students have got from this archive is ridiculous. My initial goals, to go back to talk about what I wanted to see, my initial goals of having Las Vegas be represented and have a little bit of our stories relevant and something other than the fact that there are no people on the strip. It's actually kind of really creepy. There are no people on the strip. A lot of our city is really paused. But we know that, we see that in media. So I really wanted to get their stories and what they were doing and see get them to think. What they really do is they think about what is important for them to say and how these government controls affect them. And there's really a benefit to how they learn to research here, learn why, they look at what other people are uploading, and they really get involved with it. So the idea that an assignment can give such a push to active learning and to active research has done a lot to engage my students with the material and to make them ask questions. I've had a lot of questioning come out of here of, can the governor do this? Here's an example. Can the federal government do this? Who gets to be in control of respirators? And really led to some great talks about federalism. So this is the assignment that I wanted to share with you. There's a link to the PDF of it that's all put together properly. And you also have a link to my slides. I welcome any questions. I apologize for the lack of sharing in the beginning. And I look forward to speaking with you in question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martha. That's so, like, as being someone who sees everything on the other end, I feel like, I mean, I don't know, my mind is blown. All of these things that the way you've been experiencing it on your end makes me wish that I would have heard you talk about this sooner.
Right? It's all
but maybe something, yes, it's all coming full circle. Maybe something we can talk about a little more in our discussion section. But we have, last but not least, we have Jim McGrath. Jim McGrath is currently a part-time instructor at Northeastern University, where he teaches courses in digital public history, spatial storytelling, and public humanities. He's the former project co-director of Our Marathon, the Boston Bombing Digital Archive, a community project hosted by Northeastern. And he is the current public humanities lead on the Rhode Island COVID-19 Archive, a project supported by the Providence Public Library and the Rhode Island Historical Society. Jim has published work in Doing Public Humanities, edited by Susan Smoylin, Digital Humanities Quarterly, American Quarterly, and The Public Historian. Okay, go ahead, Jim.
Hi, thanks, Marissa. Marissa, how much time do I have?
We're going for 90 minutes, so you have.
So I have 90 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
No, we're only an hour in, so we have 30 minutes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll try to be a little bit quick here, so we have time for Q&A. Thanks for everyone attending. If you notice my name in the Zoom, it's because I'm on my personal Zoom account and not my professional Zoom account. This is my professional attire, though, unfortunately. So I wanted to talk a bit about Journal of the Plague Year from the perspective of someone who both teaches particularly undergraduate courses and graduate level courses, but also works on a lot of this kind of these kind of initiatives. And you know, I don't want to come off as kind of a wet blanket in terms of some of the concerns that I have about bringing this work into the classroom, but I do want to make some suggestions about how people who, particularly instructors and students who are new to this kind of work, might be really thinking about the implications of doing this sort of work in the classroom. And I think part of this experience comes from being someone, I have a PhD in English, I'm not a trained archivist, but I did do a lot of work, and I have done a lot of work in archives and digital archives as a result of being the co-director of the Our Marathon Digital Archive project. And a lot of these perspectives come from having conversations with archivists and with librarians and with community archivists and practitioners who get really excited about when instructors and particularly students are working in archival spaces and thinking about archival context in the classroom, but also, you know, want to have a sense that the people bringing this work into those spaces have a sense of the long histories and ongoing work that these professionals are doing. I mean, a lot of the concerns or the issues that might come up as you're bringing this work into your classroom, if you go and look into spaces and find readings by people who've been thinking about this stuff for years, you'll realize that a lot of these concerns and questions that are coming up are not new, right? They, you know, some of them have changed a bit because of the way that rapid response collections have changed our ideas of what an archive is and the sort of potential for people to take up archival work or work that gets situated as archival work. But I think it's still important to really be thinking about how we are in conversation with those sorts of spaces, and also what happens to the classroom when we bring these kinds of projects into the classroom. I think, you know, pedagogically speaking, you're kind of decentering some of the traditional modes of instruction in student output, the kind of work that they're doing. And we see sometimes some tensions come up when people do this kind of public facing work in the classroom, but still bring the expectations that they have for more traditional assignments, papers, and things like that in there. The sort of most notorious example of this for me is when, and instructors still do this a bit, when instructors got really excited about using Wikipedia in the classroom, but then we're assigning kind of like 5-paragraph essay Wikipedia prompts that don't really acknowledge the realities of how information circulates in a space like Wikipedia. And similarly, you know, asking students to create material that is public facing and that is, you know, designed for not just short-term use given the interest in the pandemic, but also long-term use. That's a different kind of work. And I think we want to be really transparent and direct with our students as we're sort of thinking through the implications of taking up this work. So I have 3 areas, I guess, that I've been thinking a bit about, particularly as they relate to instructors who are thinking about doing this work a bit more, or instructors who have been doing this work and might be thinking differently about it. So I have a sort of self-assessment space in this Google Doc that I've shared, which I find to be a series of useful questions that we ask ourselves before we take up this work and get a sense of the labor and the time and the challenges that it presents. And then I have some recommendations for reviewing Journal of the Plague Year materials in a classroom context, and then also creating content for Journal of the Plague Year. And I think some instructors might want to do both in their classes. And I think that this, you know, we've seen examples of this today, and we've seen different workflows and projects come out of that. But that's a lot of work to take up in one class, you know, and especially in the sort of span of however long your semester or your fall or your spring is. If we look at archival initiatives outside of the classroom context, like some of this work takes years, decades, and the work of just gathering materials and assessing materials and moving it into a space like an archival context, right? That doesn't happen in a month or in like the last 2 weeks of a semester or things like that. And I know that, you know, as we're sort of managing our time and thinking through this stuff, we really want to acknowledge those realities and be candid about them and think about the work that we can do in the time that we have. And this is to say that you can do some work. And you know, I'd argue we've seen lots of great examples of the work that you can do in a semester calendar or a fall or a spring calendar here. But it's really important to be realistic about those constraints and then work within them a bit. And then similarly, from your own perspective, you want to kind of take a moment and take a step back and have a sense of like what you know already and what you are sort of prepared to do. And I've brought in some keywords and some questions that I've had in the context of teaching that I've done. And just for some additional context, I've taught archival rapid response work to undergrads. I've taught to high school students. I've taught to graduate students, and I've taught to classes where we've had graduate students and undergrads in the same space. Currently, I'm working with Journal of the Plague Year in 2 classes. One is a graduate course at Northeastern where we're just talking about the collection. We had a few weeks on archives and 1 week on rapid response collections and looked at it there. And then in another class, I'm co-teaching at ASU, an asynchronous course with Mark Thibault, co-taught with Mark Thibault. That's an oral history practices course. That's a graduate course, and the students are creating oral histories that will be ideally submitted to Journal of the Plague Year there. So there's 2 different contexts even in the span of this semester. But, you know, I find that, you know, so I've got this sort of list of questions, and I'm not going to walk through every single list. I'm just going to try and cover some of this stuff in 5 minutes so we have some time for discussion. Just reviewing archival materials and archival context in a classroom context, I think is really generative and really important. And the high school class that I taught, it was part of a Brown Summer Leadership Institute, and it was in a course called Media Literacy in the Age of Fake News and Big Data, right? So it's and we didn't talk about Journal of the Plague Year because this was before the pandemic, but we did talk about rapid response collections like our marathon and other spaces there too. And I think these are real opportunities, you know, just to have students be engaging with and looking at the sites and the materials and the sort of larger world around these particular sites. It gets them thinking about the archival literacy, data literacy, and or media literacy. And you might not be explicit and call them that depending on the level of course that you have, but these are important areas, places where we need, I think, arguably more instruction, more conversations in classroom context. And you can create work and create assignments and conditions where they're just asking very direct and candid questions about a project like this. One question that I love to ask of projects like this with students is, how does this look different from the rest of the web? Like, I think it's really important to acknowledge the rest of the internet. And like, so when they come into a space like Journal of the Plague Year and they're like, wait, like the search engine is not that great. And like the pages are just like designed in this very different way. And I've got all these drop-down menus, it's very different from the, the context that they're looking at on their phone. Or, you might say, hey, what does this look like on your phone versus what does this look like on your screen? And how do the sort of design choices kind of impact stuff? Or how do you, I think students are really interested in particular kinds of material. How would you bring material from a social media space into a space like an archival context? What would you be able to retain easily? What would be missing in terms of the social dynamic and engagement that comes up in a comments, or the fact that, on social media feeds, they're constantly moving and changing, so that like a joke in a meme, 2 months ago might not be legible now, let alone 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So I think there's lots of great opportunities just to have conversations about what an archival project like Journal of the Plague Year is trying to do in a moment like this, and get them thinking about their own personal experiences in that regard. And in the context of taking up work, creating content, and Mark Thibault sort of brought this up in the Q&A. I think the first thing to really remember, and I'm thinking about this a lot with the graduate classes I'm thinking, is this is an ongoing traumatic event. Like the Boston Marathon project and doing work on that project as a graduate student was kind of temporally a bit more fixed. It was about a week. And then there, obviously there's the sort of aftermath of the city, but even moving through a physical space like Boston that had been through a traumatic event still lingered and really impacted our relationship to the kind of work we're doing. This event is still unfolding. It's getting worse in some spaces, and there's been all sorts of different benchmarks and tumultuous aspects of this, and some generative aspects of it too. So I think it's really important, like when you're asking students to sort of dwell on this subject matter and to think about it, that we sort of take a step back and acknowledge what might be too challenging, what might be too difficult to do. At the same time, I think, there's a real interest in born digital material and stuff that's sort of all over the web. You want to avoid taking what I would call, and others have called, an extractive approach, where it's just, if you're seeing stuff online, it's like, okay, it's online. Okay, the social media site, it's public. Let's just grab it and put it in the archive. There are lots of scholars and critics who have talked about the sort of ethical dimensions of doing that stuff, and the need to ask for permission. And even in your sort of own personal archives and personal materials, like going to a protest and taking pictures that you've taken at a protest and sharing those in an online space. We've seen lots of examples of protest images being used in surveillance culture and being used to target activists, right? So those contexts don't go away in an archival context. So you really want to be thinking about the implications of bringing something like this into certain materials into an archival space. I really like this sort of emphasis on learning goals, not the sort of quantity of submissions and the number of submissions. In the context of this oral history course that we're co-teaching, like I'm even thinking a bit about like they have to do 2 oral histories. I'm thinking like, is 2 too many, for the course of a small course, and then what happens to those materials? How does that material get evaluated? We've seen lots of great examples of workflows that kind of show the importance of an instructor being a mediating presence and offering lots of insight and sort of feedback on the work that gets taken up in those classes. So I'll just sort of point to the folks who've talked previously about some good uses of that. Personally speaking, I like a submission workflow where I am mediating submissions before they move into something like Journal of the Plague Year. And then, in this context for this oral history course, I'm even thinking that I'm going to be the one to sort of move that stuff in to JOTPY after the semester, just so that I can because oral history is such a sort of challenging space, particularly challenging space to work in. But don't assume that students are just going to kind of figure out metadata work, initially, or have a sense of what is appropriate to focus on or what's appropriate to bring in, and then also give yourself time to do this kind of work. I mean, as folks have said, this is a lot of extra labor that's being brought into the classroom context. So you want to account for that. So I would sort of, just to wrap up, like I would say start small and then think about scaling up. You know, start with a smaller assignment if you're new to this work. Think about the advantages of maybe just bringing this kind of project into your classroom rather than participating to it necessarily right away, and reflect on what worked and what did not work and what might be moving forward. So this doc has some bullet point questions. I will be adding just some suggested readings and projects to this doc in the next 24 hours, but you have the link and this link will still work. So you'll be able to see those there. But I did want to share here are some other projects or other sort of contexts that you might bring into a classroom that's taking up this work. So that's it for me. Thank you, Marissa.
Thanks, Jim. So we have let's see how long. So we have about 15 minutes or so. We always try to cut these off around 90 minutes. Keep in mind this is being recorded, so we have some folks who had to leave early or coming late or who couldn't make it, and they'll get the recording. So I want to try to make sure that we answer questions that folks have, no matter what. So let's see what we have here now. And if you're an attendee and you want to get your question in, go ahead and use the Q&A function so that we can all see and we can address it. There's a couple questions here that I feel like maybe I'm the best qualified to answer, but I'm not going to do those first because I'm not a panelist. So let's see. Jim mentioned this a little bit too, but I'd like to hear from the other panelists too. How are you dealing with the trauma experienced by your students during the crisis? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I'd love to jump in, Marissa. So I think, and Jim, as you were talking, I was furiously jotting down notes because it is very, very important for us to protect our students and help them understand what they're engaging in, and the trauma of what they're experiencing right now is very, very real and it is ongoing. And so they deserve us to advocate for them. And the way that I'm doing that on my campus is very similar to what Jim said. I'm pre-screening the submissions before they go through. I'm talking to students about the implications of what they're putting into the archive. And then if there is, I can tell like my student that lost her mother, I'm working with our resources on campus to best support that student as much as the student wants and needs. So we have a social worker on campus. We've got a robust counseling department. And so all of that is absolutely part of the work. I'm glad that Mark asked that question, and Jim, I'm glad that you really expanded on that too in your talk.
Anyone else? Oh, go ahead, Martha.
So we're going to see if I can share my screen again for a second, because I want to talk about this slide that was submitted. And so this slide is a student who submitted their name, who has all of their names in here and just uploaded it. And so when I went through and I was going through and checking all their submissions, I saw this and went, oh no, like this could be bad. And I was very fortunate that actually the journal caught this before I did. Like the curators came in and they put this on private and they were like, oh dear. And so I was very glad to see that happen. And this was one of the reasons I brought this slide and put this slide up, is because your students may do things like this. And so maybe I should have had a better awareness that, oh God, this could happen. But for me to have this, in some ways, this raw amount of honesty is incredibly excellent for the archive and the authentic nature. But this is one of my freshmen. This is how you get fired, right? Like you can't have this in a public archive searchable by your name. And if it wasn't for some curator in the archive being on it, this is really bad. So, I mean, I would only like my slides to show the absolute best of me. But I think one of the reasons why this is important to share is because this is real and this happens. And I will say teaching in the archive is where I've gotten the most experiences of trauma. We have a student help request form at UNLV, and I have filled it out a lot. I have encountered suicidal ideation, which I don't think belongs in the talk. I have discovered people who have lost their parents and are living alone in a house, like they don't know anything. This stuff comes up. And, you know, I'm in college, I'm not, and I'm remote. So when I get these students, it keeps me up at night. I am fortunate that UNLV has a form that I fill out. I have a counselor that calls me and says, we're on it. And then we handle them. But like, This is real. This happens, and they don't have the education or knowledge yet to know that you shouldn't put this on the internet. So it's really something. I really hear Jim when he says, be aware that this could happen. Because yeah, I learned that the hard way. I mean, they caught it. It was no harm, no foul, but this shouldn't be public, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something where in the archive on the curatorial end, we want to approach submissions from younger folks very cautiously, because we don't know if they know the dangers of oversharing, or we don't know if they understand that or not. We can't assume that they know that. So I'm glad that that the curator caught that, and yeah, we now have a more kind of we have a review procedure. I think one of the things that Shanna showed had the word review on the title. That means that it's private. She could see it because she has back-end access, but it's private, so that the compliance officer who is dealing with privacy and things, which is currently me, will review it and figure out if it's appropriate for it to be public or not, because it's especially important with folks who are under 18, but even folks who are also just maybe young adults who don't quite understand the repercussions. So there's a question from Chris Twing to Morgan and Shanna, who deal with the younger folks. Do you worry that your students will find info that's too mature for them? I imagine she means in the archive.
I think that's a worry anytime our students decide to access the internet or social media in any sort. I think that kids are seeing a lot of things on their phones. In terms of the archive, we work with the archive in my class in the classroom. So even though we're in a hybrid model, I make sure that we work with it in the classroom just because they have full access to it. And that is a wonderful thing. But at the same time, if they see something and they're like, whoa, okay, that hand goes up, and it opens up a conversation for us. So one of the biggest things in working with the archive, I guess, and my experience has been having that rapport with the kids where they're willing to ask you those questions and to have those tough conversations. There was a study we just did a unit on media literacy, and it was a study coming out by Stanford arguing for or against web filters on student devices. Are we doing them a disservice by keeping their device entirely filtered and not allowing them to kind of like sift through stuff? So I kind of take that approach, I guess. A lot of that is relationship building early on, and then it's just being willing to have a conversation with a student about whatever they may encounter.
I would completely echo Morgan. They are out there already on the internet, and I think one of the biggest gifts that we can give them is the skill to navigate that information and the ability to have difficult conversations if they encounter something that makes them feel uncomfortable. So same here, exact same process.
I think Victoria had a comment before about something. I don't know if it's still relevant. Sorry to put you on the spot, Victoria.
Oh, no, not at all. It's sort of related to trauma. So we can go back to it later, but I do think we should get through the rest of these questions.
Well, we have another question about trauma. So why don't you go ahead, Victoria, because we have a question from Ankita Sharma that says, how would you evaluate this as a teacher? How much is too much to share? If trauma doesn't get representation, how does it heal eventually? So the maybe kind of cathartic aspect of like sharing this trauma versus traumatizing your students, like where is that line?
I think another thing that has come up as I've been working with other classes over the course of the semester, and this is something that came up in some work I did on oral histories with students at Amherst College, where we were talking about what I might think of as a reverberating trauma, where the students weren't writing about their own personal experience, but they were interviewing people in their communities, whether those communities are located at Amherst or in the places that they had grown up, and how to be, as they were collecting these oral histories, mindful of the experience of the people that they were interviewing. And Jim used the term extractive when he was talking about how important it is to know that, as you pull information, whether it's information from the web or information from a person who's sharing their story with you one-on-one, how do you treat that information carefully and with respect? And also being aware that any story that gets told to you, especially as a young person, it's going to imprint, right? I remember, 20 years ago at this point, talking to some curators who were collecting oral histories from 9/11 survivors. And they ended up hiring a therapist for the staff to go to, because the process of collecting those stories was literally giving the oral historians PTSD. And so I think that on the one hand, giving students the room to share, to represent, to express those stories in whatever way they want to or need to is terrific. But I also think that we need to be aware that having them gather, go through, I mean, I don't like using the word triggering because it has gotten really politicized, but like, man, it brings up a lot of stuff. So I think that in terms of directing students towards, mental health organizations, whatever you need to do, make it as easy as possible. Slip that link in your syllabus or put it on your PowerPoint slide, but be aware that the trauma that students may experience, it may be their own, but it also may be reflected. So I just think that that's an important additional consideration.
Great, thank you.
I would echo that really hard. Like, also take care of yourselves when you get this stuff. Like, I've had to walk away from my monitor, fill out my student help form, and be like, "Hey, partner, like, I got to talk to you about this confidential thing because, oh my God, my poor student." So take care of yourself, because if you're down, you can't lead them.
That's a really good point. And that's the curators, I think on the back end, we have to remind ourselves of that too, because we're looking at all of this stuff and we don't always know the people personally, but just the sheer volume can be upsetting, There was one thing I wanted to mention. Dr. Cole mentioned the changing of tags is a good thing to discuss in Q&A. So Martha had mentioned that we collect contributor tags, so suggestions for tags from folks who are submitting to the archive. And because we're kind of learning as we go along, as all rapid response projects do, initially we were we had curators who were instructed that this was best practice at the time, to use the contributor tags and kind of build off of them to create their own tags. So yeah, they would change the contributor tags or build off of them or pick and choose which ones they thought were appropriate. And then a few months ago, we sort of realized that we didn't want to do it that way, that we wanted to allow curators to tag things in a way that they thought was useful for the archive, but we also wanted to preserve the contributors' tags as they were contributed, and just kind of have two different parallel folksonomies, or like a taxonomy and then a folksonomy. And so we're still in the process of re-curating some of the older items where the contributor tags have been orphaned, right? And those are some of the ones that I think you're talking about, Martha. And so moving forward, as of, I think, sometime in August, we preserve the contributor tags totally separately from the curator tags. And the only changing that we do is remove the hashtag sometimes if it's something like hashtag camping or something, if it's a hashtag, if the hashtag isn't necessary in order to understand the term. So that is something that we kind of learned as we went along, I think. And it's again, basically people submitting things from now on should have a different experience in that regard. And so I just wanted to address that because Mark Thibault and Dr. Cole both sort of mentioned it in the Q&A. But there's a question from Dr. Cole that says, what do your graduate students think about the archive? And so I think that's aimed at Jim. Does that sound?
I can answer this question and then go teach my grad class, which
okay. Sounds great.
So I think graduate students are interested in these kinds of works, but are also I think sometimes skeptical about community-oriented projects that seem to be centralized at academic institutions. So I think it's really important to think through some of that stuff. Like, okay, so like the academic institution is inscribing value on this, and then like telling everyone, and also this kind of also gets into what Victoria was talking about the extractive approach. I think a term that comes up a lot in the long history of oral history is the idea of shared authority. And that gets complicated, and there's lots of ways around it. But like, if you are asking people to participate in something like that, like what are they getting out of it, right? You're getting conference talks, seminar. I'm on a sort of Brady Bunch panel right now talking about this thing, right? But what are the people who are contributing this stuff? What's the sort of value built into them? So students are really interested, I think, in some of those contexts, and they're very interested in design choices. And the professional spaces, like design choices in that like academic projects look like academic projects, but then like they live on the web. And I think that's really important. That's like my bread and butter. But then also like who's doing this work and how are they compensated? Like I'm someone who has works for 3 different institutions right now. And I think I'm pretty good at doing this sort of work, right? So like talking to people who are from like the last 5 years of higher ed and like who are doing this work and like where they're landing and where they're living. They're very curious about that, how you sort of navigate the sort of value that comes from doing this work with also the sort of professional realities of like how you make the case that this is valuable work to do to people who might hire you long-term, short-term, or whatever. So yeah, so those are some things that they're interested in thinking about. And now I gotta go. Bye.
See you, Jim. Thank you. So since we're at our end here, I do just want to. Oh, one thing. The other question was for Jim. So sorry, Chris Twing. We're not going to answer your question. Well, it says more about the ethics of capturing public social media, and I think that kind of is building off of the copyright question that someone sent a little bit earlier, and it's an iffy sort of thing. But do any of you as instructors, how do you approach the copyright question? Or do you approach the copyright question?
I don't. I make it your problem.
I know.
There's no reason that I have to address it. Like, what do I mean? Why not? And if there was a best practices that told me how to do it better, that told me this, because I just learned this in here, that the student should find the original source with the original author, I can easily put that in. But I didn't really think.
We don't, usually just the curator will do that. Just try to look, because sometimes it's clear. Sometimes it's like, okay, it's this specific Reddit user made this meme. But the nature of memes is that we don't know where they came from. That's almost like what a meme means, So we don't worry too much about memes. And yeah, we are the ones who are dealing with the copyright things. But I just wondered if any of you have thought about it before in terms of like, I don't know, if you've had students like, I don't know, scanning their textbooks or something, I don't know, something like that to submit to the archive, that maybe, cause you to sort of question. But no, you haven't come across it. I come across it on my end, so maybe that's just it's a back end sort of thing, a back end question. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions. I just want to thank you all so much for taking the time to come and tell us about your experiences. And I learned a ton from being a sort of back end person. I learned more than I thought that I could. It's really interesting. And any of the folks who are registered for today's session, we can, when we send out the link to the recording, we can maybe also send the links out that you all shared in the chat so that everybody has all the materials. I'll take a lead at sort of collecting all of those things. So look out for those, everybody. Yeah, thank you so much. If the panelists could just stay for a minute, if you have a minute, we'll say goodbye to all of the attendees. Goodbye.